Hi, all. We'll be starting our first in our lecture series with Dr. Rachel Walker in about 2 minutes. I think that was about 2 minutes. It felt like a long time.
Like 2 minutes. Yeah.
it felt like a long time. So let's get started. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Rachel Walker to our Women's History Month lecture series at USM, the WGS department. I should say my name is Carrie Concelia, and I'm a lecturer in English and in Women and Gender Studies here at USM. As I mentioned earlier, this is our first in a host of lectures that we'll be giving this month for Women's History Month. Dr. Rachel Walker's talk is entitled Reading the Gendered Body in Early America. Dr. Walker specializes in the history of gender, race, and popular science in early America. She is currently working on her first book project, which uncovers the history of physiognomy, which I hope I pronounced correctly. Thank you. A once popular but now discredited science, rooted in the idea that people's facial beauty reveals their moral and mental character. Her book, Beauty in the Brain, The Science of the Mind in Early America, is slated to come out with the University of Chicago Press, fall 2022. Her recent work has been published in Early American Studies, and her most recent fellowship is a long-term National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, co-sponsored by the American Antiquarian Society. We're very happy to have Dr. Walker here, and feel free to take it away. We'll have Dr. Walker speak, and then we will take questions afterwards using the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen.
Thank you, Carrie. And I just wanted to say thanks for tuning in to hear a little bit more about my research. Thanks in particular to the Women's and Gender Studies program for inviting me to be a part of your lecture series, to my friend Ashley Toll for suggesting me in the first place, and to Carrie Concelia especially for doing all of the organizational work that made this talk possible. So what I wanted to do today is give you kind of a brief overview of my larger book project, but then to delve specifically into some of the parts of the project that deal with women and gender, since it's a Women's History Month lecture. Of course, I have plenty more to say about race, about class, about science and power. So if you're interested in any of those topics, then hopefully there'll be some time at the end for a more informal question and answer period. But today, I wanted to present my talk on reading the gendered body in early America. I imagine that a lot of you here are women and gender studies majors or minors at USM, or at least kind of broadly interested in the topic of gender. And one of the biggest foundational assumptions of gender studies is that gender is a social construct. So it's not just a biological reality that like some people's brains and bodies are male and some are innately female. Gender is actually something a lot bigger and broader and squishier than that. It's a category that societies construct and enforce and negotiate over time. And as a historian, I'm particularly interested in how ideas about gender change over time, right? But I'm also especially interested in how gender operates on a practical level. So if gender is something that has to be kind of continually constructed, then how do people construct it? What do they do, right? How do we decide as a society what counts as masculine and what counts as feminine? How do we link our decisions about masculinity and femininity? How do we link our values, our assumptions, and our ideas about gender to the human body in particular? And I think this is a really important question. How do we rely on science to both rationalize what we think to be true about gender and to also defend our ideas? And how do we use science to kind of frame these things that are socially constructed as inherently biological or as empirical realities that can be discerned from the human body? So those are basically the big questions that drive me as a scholar. I'm interested in how people historically make sense of gender, how they do so on the ground, and especially how people use science on the ground, like how science ends up filtering into popular culture. And I'm particularly interested in how people talk about the body and the brain in gendered ways. So all of those interests led me to my book project, which is about beauty, science, and power in early America. I am going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint for today. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think everyone can see my screen probably at this point. Yes? Oh, I can't see anyone. Never mind. Okay, so yes, you can. Okay, great. So basically, let's talk about how people read gendered bodies in early America. So to get there, I wanted to kind of give you an overview of a relatively brief overview of my book project, which focuses on physiognomy and phrenology in early America. Physiognomy and phrenology were once enormously popular disciplines, even though they've now been debunked or discredited. But you might be wondering, what are physiognomy and phrenology and why should I care about them? So I will tell you. Physiognomy is a science that emerges in the 1770s. Well, it's a much longer discipline that stretches back hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the 1770s, European white intellectuals begin arguing that physiognomy is not just a system for making sense of faces. Physiognomy can be a science. So the assumption of physiognomy as a science is that a person's facial features can reveal their internal character, their intelligence, and their personality. So essentially, if I want to figure out what makes you tick as a person, how smart you are, how intelligent you are, how generous you are, whether or not you're jealous or selfish, if you are going to be a good mother or if you're going to be a thief, then all I have to do is analyze your facial features. So in the 1770s, this science begins spreading all throughout the world and eventually makes it to the North American continent. And then in the early 19th century, phrenology emerges as well. So phrenology basically takes for granted all of the assumptions of physiognomy. It basically says like, yes, of course, the face does reveal character. But phrenologists think that it's actually more important to analyze the bumps and crevices of the cranium in order to figure out character. So what they do is they essentially argue that the brain can be divided into all of these different parts. Some parts are related to intellect, some parts are related to emotion and moral sentiments, and some parts of the brain are related to kind of like your animalistic urges, right? So they put like, for instance, the desire to eat or have sex in the back of your head, at the back of your brain, whereas they put thinking in the forehead. You might have heard the phrases highbrow and lowbrow. Highbrow and lowbrow are actually phrases that are tied to phrenology and physiognomy because both phrenologists and physiognomists argued that a higher brow, so a bigger forehead, was correlated with intelligence. And so that's why we associate highbrow, the word highbrow, with things that we attach cultural importance to, like reading the New Yorker, going to the opera, or kind of like going to an art museum or something like that. So phrenology becomes enormously popular in the United States, especially in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So in this project, this isn't just a project that recovers the history of physiognomy and phrenology. On one level, I do want to do that. I think it's really common now to kind of dismiss these sciences as quirky and misguided pseudosciences that have no value for the present. And to be fair, I am not arguing that we should actually take these sciences seriously as like legitimate ways of analyzing intelligence and character. But I think it is important to recover the history of these sciences, because these sciences were the primary ways, the primary tools that people were using to make sense of each other and make sense of their own brains and bodies. This was an era before we had the advent of modern neuroscience or psychology. And so people were using physiognomy and phrenology to figure out like facts that they thought to be crucial about each other. But I also think that studying these sciences can be really important for US history in particular, because it helps us see how science can be used to make sense of social inequality. So in 1776, when the United States declares independence from Britain, they declare that they are fighting for a world in which principles like liberty and justice and the pursuit of happiness are valued. They articulate all of these egalitarian ideals. They say they're fighting for equality. They say they're fighting for justice. And at the same time, they create this really unjust, inequitable society. And so the question for me, and for a lot of scholars, I'm not the only scholar to be fascinated with this, but like the question for me is, okay, so if they're simultaneously saying that they love equality and then also setting up a society that doesn't value equality, then how are they justifying that to themselves? How do they rationalize it? How do they make it make sense? And for me, the big question then becomes, okay, not only how do they rationalize it to themselves, but how do they use science especially to do so? And so I think it's important to study the history of physiognomy and phrenology, because physiognomy and phrenology were two of the sciences that people were using to make sense of inequality. So in the early American Republic, they begin using physiognomy quite early. There's a big physiognomical treatise written by a Swiss cleric, and he actually puts portraits of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington into his physiognomical treatises. Americans are pumped about this because they're like, look, we're already on the international stage. You know, we already have scientific thinkers writing and thinking and talking about us. But they essentially say that, like, okay, well, if your brain is reflected in your body, then maybe some people just have better brains and better bodies than other people. And if some people simply have better brains and bodies than other people, then maybe those people deserve extra political and economic and legal privileges. So in a way, physiognomy and phrenology become sciences for rationalizing the idea that some people are better than others. And those better, more virtuous, more intelligent people with better character are actually justified in taking control of society. So in the early American Republic, you have all of these efforts to frame political figures like George Washington and Ben Franklin as people with superior brains and bodies. I'm not sure exactly why they included images like this of Ben Franklin, which is not particularly flattering, but they essentially argue that, like, Benjamin Franklin's large forehead indicates his intelligence, that his large eyes indicate that he's a perceptive thinker, that his large head in general is an index of his mental power. And even when the faces of revolutionary leaders do not align with physiognomic standards according to European intellectuals, they find ways around it. They find ways of being like, well, yeah, sure, like George Washington's forehead isn't the greatest, but like we already know that he's a great man. So maybe the person who drew the portrait or drew the engraving kind of messed up. So this continues into the middle decades of the 19th century. And this is when phrenology becomes especially popular. So physiognomy and phrenology are kind of working together to shape how people see gender. So people like Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, who are pictured here, they end up becoming these masculine ideals of what it means to look like you are a political leader. Daniel Webster in particular, he becomes this kind of like physiognomic or phrenological specimen of superior humanity. They repeatedly paint him with a large, expansive forehead and protruding brows, with powerful dark eyes. They emphasize the angularity of his features. That's something that they do with John C. Calhoun as well. They always focus on how angular his face is and how that's an index of his power, his mental power. And so in some ways, people are using scientific language, not just in scientific treatises, but they're using it in newspapers. They're using it in magazines. They're using it in, they're putting up legitimate portrait galleries in museums, and kind of putting forward men like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun as these representatives of what it means to look like a political leader in early America. Now, you might also, you're probably not surprised to learn that people also use physiognomy and phrenology to rationalize and justify racism. So you can see an image here. This is from a book called New Physiognomy. And in this image, they're basically comparing what they call grades of intelligence. As you can see here, the supposed grade of intelligence, the person becomes less intelligent as their facial angle changes over time. And you can probably see that on one side, there is a white American. On the other side is a Black American. Physiognomy and phrenology basically provide an intellectual justification for racism, making it seem like Black Americans are not in a subordinate position in society because of structural inequalities, but that they are in a subordinate position in society because of their own anatomical and physiological inferiorities. And so this is a way of making racism seem okay because it's scientifically justified. But one of the curious things that I have discovered in my own research is that you would think that physiognomy and phrenology would be adopted by the privileged and powerful. That makes sense, right? It's logical, because this is a way of proving that certain people just have better craniums and better skulls and more impressive facial features. And as a result, their superior position in society is justified. But what I actually found in my research is that some of the most enthusiastic facial and cranial analyzers in early America were not privileged and powerful white male scientific thinkers and politicians. Instead, they were political reformers and radicals. People like Frederick Douglass, who was a famous abolitionist. People like William Lloyd Garrison, who was also a famous abolitionist, who worked closely with Frederick Douglass. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who fought for women's suffrage. All of these figures, to some degree, embrace physiognomy and phrenology and use the language. And for them, physiognomy and phrenology are not these discriminatory discourses that allow them to rationalize inequality. Instead, they embrace physiognomy and phrenology as subversive and radical sciences that might help them advocate for racial justice and gender equality. So that leads to a much bigger question, which is like, all right, why? Why did so many progressive activists and marginalized people embrace these sciences? What did they think that they were gaining from these sciences? And why would they take the discourses that were essentially being used to denigrate them and instead repurpose them and use them for their own political aims? Why not reject physiognomy and phrenology? Why are they adopting and co-opting these disciplines? And I've come to a few big conclusions. I think the first is just that physiognomy and phrenology were considered to be legitimate sciences at the time. So people took them seriously. And I think if we are actually going to understand the cultural and scientific worldview of early Americans, then we have to take physiognomy and phrenology seriously too. But because people took them seriously, they were ubiquitous within popular culture and scientific culture, and they were also accessible. So at the time, African Americans and women are blocked from institutions of higher education. They do not have access to laboratories. They do not have access to college educations. And they often don't have access to the resources that make scientific study possible. But anyone can be a facial or cranial analyzer. All you need is a pair of eyes or potentially a pair of hands and the ability to look at others. And so as a result, plus, I mean, physiognomy and phrenology are everywhere in the nation's newspapers, magazines, artistic works, novels. The language of these sciences shows up basically everywhere. So as a result, they provide this like ubiquitous and accessible language that people who are marginalized can actually latch onto and use for their own purposes. The second thing is that physiognomy and phrenology also have relatively flexible and adaptable doctrines. So what I mean by this is that we tend to think of physiognomy and phrenology as these sciences that are essentially stepping stones on the road to biological determinism, scientific racism, and eugenics. But in reality, physiognomy and phrenology, they have really kind of squishy rules. There's not really like a reproducible method. And most physiognomists and phrenologists don't actually argue that your body is your destiny. In fact, they argue that as long as you improve your internal character, then you can actually change your physical beauty. So if you improve your brain, then you can make your forehead bigger and more expansive. If you work on your moral character, then your face will look more virtuous. And as a result, this provides kind of a justification for the American meritocratic ethos, which is this idea that like, so long as you work hard enough, then you can be anyone, go anywhere, and do anything. And this is a really appealing message to people who are marginalized by the broader society. And so in some ways, these sciences present an alternative to biological determinism, even as they provide a lot of the intellectual foundation for biological determinism as an ideology. So like in some ways, yes, these sciences are arguing that your body reflects your character, and they are arguing that your internal worth can be determined by scientific study of the human body. But they are not arguing that either the body or the brain is unchangeable. And as a result, a lot of people adopt these sciences and use them to argue that like, inequality doesn't have to exist the way it does. And even if people are not, this becomes kind of a problematic argument, right? Where they say like, perhaps equality of brain doesn't exist, but perhaps it could exist, right? So it's like simultaneously this problematic and hopeful message. Now, of course, when people of color, progressive activists, white women adopt these sciences, they essentially end up validating the idea that external beauty reveals internal worth. They also validate the idea that the body can be studied scientifically and that you can gain useful information by essentially physically examining someone else. And as a result, they end up lending credence to this broader idea of like biopolitical scrutiny, basically. But at the same time, I think it's still really important to study these disciplines for a few reasons. I think it reminds us that science was both a tool of oppression and a subversive weapon that people could use to fight for racial justice and gender equity. I think that this story also reminds us that the cultural and scientific universe of early America was complex and contradictory and vibrant. There's lots of experimentation and debate. And white male thinkers were not the only people producing scientific knowledge. And if we don't take physiognomy and phrenology seriously, then we're not going to be able to understand the worldviews of the people that we're studying. And we're not going to understand how they comprehended abstract concepts like race or gender or beauty or intelligence, right? All of those ideas are social constructs. And so we have to figure out like, okay, so like, how did they in their society construct them? So that's kind of like a big introduction. And I want to get more into the concept of thinking about gender. So let's think about that last point that I raised, right? How are early Americans making gender feel real, practical, and meaningful on the ground. In other words, how did early Americans learn to see gender, and what conclusions were they drawing about bodies and brains and the gender differences between bodies and brains? I think to answer that question, we got to think about what physiognomists and phrenologists were actually saying about gender. So what were they saying about gender? Oh, and I should say, if you want to just unmute yourself and interrupt, then that's totally, and ask a question, that's totally fine with me. So I have an image here that is an image that was published by the phrenologist Lorenzo Fowler, who became one of the most famous phrenologists and physiognomists in the early American Republic. So in this is called Difference Between the Sexes. And he compares the image of the male and the female. And he argues that men typically have higher and broader foreheads, which indicates their intellectual strength. He argues that men's features tend to be more angular than women's features, and that indicates their strength of character and their resolve. And he also argues that women have more expansive back heads, right? So like the portion kind of like where your skull meets your neck, that was considered to be the portion of the human brain that correlated with your ability to mother or to parent. And as a result, he compares male and female heads in an attempt to show that women are uniquely suited for motherhood and marriage and domesticity, whereas men are suited for public activism and intellectual rigor. So this is just kind of a picture of two heads, but I'm going to give you an example from later in the century that kind of shows just how people are talking about female heads. So you can see here, it says, which is domestic? There's an image of two female heads. And in describing cut number 1, which is supposed to be the more domestic of the two, the magazine says that she represents, quote, the typical mother and model wife. Her life is devoted to her husband and children. She is not intellectually great, but she is good, which compensates for a lack of wisdom. So there's this idea that like, if a woman has those rounded features that are considered ideal for women, if they have a protruding back head, then that makes them good. It makes them model wives and mothers. Now let's see how they describe the other woman. It says, when describing cut number 2, they say children and birds. I don't know why birds, but that's what they chose. Children and birds are instinctively repelled from a woman of this description, while the most ardent man would be chilled to ice in her presence. She is a stranger to love and sentiment, a woman of dry facts devoted to selfish gain. So there's this idea that like even the most sexually adventurous man or the sexually desiring man would be chilled to ice. So women who are too selfish, women who are too intellectual are repellent and they're not sexually desirable. They also say her features are sharp, indicating keenness of selfish intellect. If she should succeed in inveigling a poor white into marriage, his life would be beset with thorns and his ears regaled with nightly curtain lectures. Curtain lectures was a phrase that 19th century people used to refer to like when a husband would get home from work and his wife would lecture him about like various topics. It's always kind of used as a derogatory term toward women. There's also examples of how they distinguish between intellectual women and so-called perfect women. So in this plate right here, you see a phrenologist's depiction of what he called a well-balanced or perfect head. That's plate 10, versus a highly intellectual female, which is plate 11. So the highly intellectual female has a much more expansive forehead. She has more angular features, and the back of her head does not protrude as much as the woman who is supposedly perfect. So where does this leave women who don't have the features that indicate a propensity for marriage and motherhood? These women were denounced as women with manly brows. There's a reason why there's such a big focus on the forehead or on the brow, because the brow is considered to be the part of the human head that best indicates your intellectual capacity. So in the 19th century, you have women who are increasingly engaging in public activism. You have women who are fighting for female suffrage. You have women who are engaging in temperance crusades, women who are joining the abolitionist and anti-slavery movements. And so all of those women increasingly start getting denounced as women with manly brows. You can see an illustration here from Harper's Bazaar from 1869. But there's also an earlier example. This image right here, you see a woman of mind. So this is essentially a woman who thinks that she's intelligent. And accompanying this image was a poem, which basically critiqued this woman for being, not only for being an intellectual, but also for not caring about her family, and then also for being too fond of phrenology. And so in the poem, it critiques this woman for ignoring her household. You can see like her children, it looks like they're sitting in front of the fire. There's like a toddler rolling around as his older sister like cries her eyes out. The other daughter is just like trying to maintain control of the situation. Meanwhile, the husband is in the center of the image, like looking confused and flabbergasted, holding a baby who is obviously screaming. The house is falling apart around him. And the woman, the wife in this picture, the wife and mother, does not care. She's just kind of like flicking her entire family away. She's wearing spectacles, which the poem said were blue, which I think is a reference to her being a blue stocking. A blue stocking was a derogatory term that was used to critique women who were too intellectual. And in the poem, it also says that this woman is essentially vain. She's vain because she cares a lot about what people think of her intelligence. But they also suggest that she's making poor fashion choices because she is so vain. And so they say that she's pulled all of her hair back so that you can see her, her intellectual brow. And they make fun in the poem of her lovely intellectual lumps and the fact that she forces her husband to pay for a phrenological exam for her. So the message of images like this are that like when women care too much about their intelligence, they are not only abdicating their responsibilities as good wives and mothers, but they're also buying into a silly science that tells them that they're smarter than they are. There's also, phrenologists are also using, physiognomists and phrenologists are also using their discipline to draw distinctions of race, class, and ethnicity. So they typically say that white women are simply more beautiful and thus more desirable than women of color. And they argue that white women, particularly those of the middling and elite classes, typically have really high foreheads, but their foreheads simply aren't broad enough to indicate the intellectual power that men have. But when they compare the foreheads of white women and women of color, they'll argue that women of color have short, retreating, or retiring foreheads. So this is meant to be like, white women are not as smart as men, but they are at least smarter than Black women. They also, you can see here, draw distinctions of ethnicity. So this is an image that compares Florence Nightingale with Bridget McBruiser, who's just like a fictional Irish woman. And it's published in an American book called New Physiognomy. You can see here, obviously, they depict Florence Nightingale as far more beautiful and refined than Bridget McBruiser. But it also comes accompanied with texts that basically say that Bridget McBruiser supposedly lives in the basement mentally, is the phrase that they use. So there's this idea that like, not only are immigrant women inferior, but that inferiority is quite literally reflected in their bodies. So phrenologists and physiognomists are not just talking about these messages in public publications. They're also enforcing these messages through direct and very personal conversations with American women. So they're analyzing American women's heads and faces. So a phrenologist will, for instance, like come to town, and as the phrenologist comes to town, he like analyzes the heads and faces of all the people in the town. And so they often give women these messages about their mental inferiority, like straight to their face, and they write them up in charts. I want to give you one example here. So these are from the diaries of Lucy Chase, who is a woman who lived in Massachusetts. And she writes in her diary about her encounter with the phrenologist. She goes, he, the phrenologist, told me that I must not study, that my brain is too large, that my physical strength was much inferior to my mental, and that much labor something, I copied this wrong, but that I should be obliged to lay aside entirely my course of study and try to be a character that has always been unpleasant to me to contemplate, a very common character. So he basically tells her, like, you're working too much on your brain. You're not working enough on your physical strength. Like, you should be putting less effort into your intellectual study because your brain is too big as it is. And she actually really resents this. She writes about it and she says later on in her journal, she writes that she has to take the place of one of her female servants in the kitchen. And so she then kind of adds this snotty aside that I presume Fowler would say that that's the place for me, right? So she's like, yeah, like the phrenologist is telling her that she should be more domestic, right? And she's resenting it. And you might think that more women would react like Lucy Chase, that they would not embrace physiognomy and phrenology, that they would reject it as this sexist discipline that denigrates their mental capacities. But actually, a lot of them don't. And in fact, Lucy Chase herself really cares what the phrenologist thinks about her. She invites him to dinner in her home. She has a private conversation with him in which she asks him how she can best attain a well-balanced brain. And then she starts analyzing the heads and faces of her friends and family members. And she's analyzing the heads and faces of public lecturers. So it's like she's embracing the scientific knowledge. And even though she resents this one encounter, she's still using it in her daily life. And in fact, most of the women who find physiognomy and phrenology most appealing are actually radicals. These are abolitionists and women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Abby Kelly and Lucretia Mott and Eliza Farnham and Amelia Bloomer, who becomes famous for the Bloomer costume, and Angelina Grimke, right? You might not know all these names, you might know them, but these are all famous women's rights activists and abolitionists in the 19th century, and they're all embracing physiognomy and phrenology. People are also just embracing physiognomy and phrenology in their daily lives. They're analyzing the faces of public figures, but also of their friends, their family members, their acquaintances. They are analyzing faces in their diaries, in their commonplace albums, and just in conversations with each other. People are even writing in to phrenological journals trying to get marriage advice. So like they'll write in, they'll be like, these are my phrenological endowments. Like, what phrenological endowment should I be looking for in a partner? The abolitionist Abby Kelly even writes to her future husband, Stephen Foster, and she writes, I am gratified to learn of your interest in Fowler on Memory, which is a phrenological text. And she goes, I've been before receiving his letter, reading it well, and I hold it in high estimation. His phrenology applied to marriage is also a work of deep interest. Will you read it as soon as you can procure it? So what she's essentially saying is she's saying to her future husband, like, hey, I've been reading phrenological ideas on marriage. And basically it's like a manual that tells people what marital partners to pick. And she wants him to read it as well. Black women, there's less evidence of Black women. We just have fewer of their letters and diaries, but we do know that Sojourner Truth got a phrenological examination of her head done in 1867. Charlotte Fortin Grimke, who is a leading Black female intellectual, also uses physiognomical and phrenological language to describe especially her white abolitionist allies. And there's a Black woman who starts her life as an enslaved woman in Virginia. She actually belongs to the brother of Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy. But she ends up getting her freedom and attending Oberlin College. And she was quite enthusiastic about phrenology. She read it alongside Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. And she also bought herself a phrenological bust, which would have looked like one of these. These are a phrenological bust from 1855 and 1869, or 1879, sorry. And she bought her bust in 1872. So it would have looked like either one of these, right? But she buys herself a phrenological bust, she subscribes to a phrenological journal, and she uses phrenology both as a serious intellectual pursuit and as a way of kind of just entertaining people when she goes off to college. So women are regularly embracing physiognomy and phrenology, even though it doesn't initially really seem to make sense. But that's because popular scientists actually often self-identified as radicals and reformers. So even though we think of phrenologists and physiognomists as like so obviously racist and sexist today, and to be clear, they were, they often thought of themselves as like anti-slavery activists and as allies of the women's rights movement. So they repeatedly published these glowing phrenological and physiognomical profiles of women's rights activists. They don't often do the same for Black women, but they do on at least one occasion describe the countenance and cranium of a woman who was a captive on the Amistad, which is the slave ship that they ended up having a rebellion. And they describe her in very positive ways as having independence, perseverance, and unusual intellectual powers. They especially focus on her forehead, which they describe as broad and high, which are terms that they usually reserve for men, and particularly prominent in its center, which is like a sign of your intellectual capacity. And they point out that the whole head is large and sustained by a vigorous constitution. So they then, of course, go on to say really kind of racist things about how, well, of course, she has all these great traits, but she's not like other Black Americans, right? So they make her like the exception that proves their racist rule. But at the same time, like if you are a Black woman in the 19th century looking for positive portrayals of the female mind and the Black female mind and body, like you can find them in the American Phrenological Journal and not in a lot of other scientific texts at the time. And so Abby Kelly, who's one of the most radical white female abolitionists of the era, she writes to her husband, and she writes that when she's reading the work of this influential phrenologist, she says, "I'm quite captivated with his straightforwardness and blunt radicalism." So female activists often think of phrenology and physiognomy as these radical disciplines. And that's because popular scientists forward this really flexible interpretation of the mind and body in which like all minds and bodies are unique and everyone ultimately has the same mental organs, and everyone is capable of improving those organs. And phrenologists actively market their science to female users. So there's an example here of Lorenzo Fowler doing an analysis of a woman named Lucy Ryder. And he tells her that she has the mental faculties to be a good scholar and also to study phrenology. So he's encouraging her to be not only a scholar, but also a scientific thinker. And women kind of take this to heart. They say like, yeah, I can be a scientific thinker. They think of these disciplines as ways to prove that they are intellectually superior. So a woman named Anna Breed, she writes to her friend, Abby Kelly, and she's like, talking about how she has this really great intellectual discussion with these women. And she goes, what did we talk about? Not about pretty babies or new gowns and caps, possible. And in Lynn too, because she's like denigrating her society for not being, as intellectually advanced as she hopes. But then she goes, our principal subjects were phrenology, physiology, physiognomy, and the climate of the self. So she thinks of physiognomy and phrenology as these subjects that increase women's intellectual horizons and prove their refinement and respectability. Now, women are embracing these sciences. They're not always doing so in the same ways that white men are doing it. And so I can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer if you're interested. But I did just want to come to a few big conclusions. First, I think that we should really take seriously the fact that physiognomy and phrenology were two of the most popular and influential tools that people used to read the gendered body in early America. Before the era of neuroscience, before psychology, like these are what people have to make sense of the brain. And even though these sciences are reinforcing discriminatory ideas about race and gender and human nature, they're also appealing to both white women and women of color because they kind of give them this model of the brain as this fundamentally improvable entity and an entity that might help them prove the equality of the sexes and the equality of the races. So if we really want to understand how early Americans made sense of gender or human difference more broadly, then I think we've got to recover this vibrant cultural and scientific universe that they inhabited. So that's all I have for you. I'm excited to hear your questions and your thoughts, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. I'm suddenly very proud of my enormous forehead. So thank you for that. I needed it.
You're welcome. I'm going to turn my light on real quick.
Okay. So if anyone has a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll have some questions for about 15 minutes. And if not, I'll queue my questions up. Okay, we have a good one from David. I'll read it here. It's wordy, so bear with me. Many authors from this period included phrenology components in the way they describe their characters, listing their personality traits as natural products of their facial features. Do you think that the current teaching of those novels, without any context provided with why those sorts of descriptions exist, could unwittingly lead people to still holding the belief that you can tell someone's character and intellect by how someone looks?
Yes, 1000%. This is like my crusade. I think about this all the time. Like I can't read any novels even today. So I think when we teach 19th century novels, I mean, I've said to literary scholars, I'm like, you cannot teach 19th century novels without understanding physiognomy and phrenology, because if you do, then like the entire cultural code that people are using to describe appearance, intelligence, and character, you're not understanding the context for that, right? You're not understanding why everyone is described with a high forehead. You're not understanding why dark eyes are considered superior to light eyes. You're not, so all of these things. But I think actually that this creates a world in which like even current novelists, like I can't even read current books because I read them and like we still have these obsessions with high foreheads. I think we've totally lost the context, and I don't think authors know what they're doing necessarily, but like I'll even read a Margaret Atwood book and she uses physiognomic and phrenological language, I think probably unthinkingly, just because she's probably read a lot of 19th century novels. And so, yeah, I think that like we have somehow managed to forget this entire cultural language that people use to make sense of the body. And we've kept the language, but we've lost the context. And as a result, we are kind of missing this whole world and scientific like culture of debate that 19th century Americans would have been completely conversant with, even if they didn't agree with it, even if they were skeptics of physiognomy and phrenology, they would have known how to speak the language.
Can I ask something related to this question?
Sure.
Can you talk more about how women in the middle decades of the 19th century were wearing their hair in certain
Oh,
styles to foreground their foreheads?
yeah. So I wanted to talk about this more, but I didn't. I ran out of time. But so in the 19th century, those like 19th century hairstyles that it's just like the hair is parted down the center and literally slicked up against the skull. You see it in all the 19th century portraits. So I have found tons of evidence that people are actually styling their hair with phrenological and physiognomical principles in mind. So most of this comes from like beauty manuals and women's magazines. I don't have necessarily, oh my God, I love the interpreter, like hair. But so I don't have evidence, like smoking gun evidence of a woman that's like, oh yeah, I decided to style my hair with phrenology in mind. But it's like all over these beauty manuals where they encourage women to style their hair in ways that emphasizes their forehead. Because if they can style their hair in a way that emphasizes their forehead and their cranial endowments, then people will be better able to read their character. And so then you get, by the 1850s, a lot of cultural conservatives are critiquing women's rights activists for wearing their hair, for slicking back their hair too much, essentially, and for doing too much to emphasize their forehead. And that's where you get the critique of like the manly brow. It's women who don't curl their hair and leave their hair in curls around their face, women who instead slick it back so that they can try and look like intellectuals, when in reality, they're just frauds.
I love it. Thank you. We have another good one from Jennifer. I would love to incorporate this topic into my US history classes. Do you have suggestions for how to incorporate this topic?
Yeah, I feel like this is so hard because I'm so like in the weeds of it, and I'm always like, we got to understand physiognomy and phrenology. We can't understand the 19th century. Like you can't understand their worldview. And then when I teach the survey, I like incorporate it in these little snippets, So where I incorporate it most is when I teach about immigration and nativism, because I think you can very clearly see all the ways in which they're using phrenological ideas to make it seem like native-born white Protestant Americans are superior to immigrants at this time. I also incorporate it on the unit where I teach about the rise of pro-slavery thought and the rise of scientific racism, because physiognomy and phrenology provide the intellectual foundation for things like Samuel Morton's craniology, which I think we're more used to teaching. But Samuel Morton is working with a phrenologist in order to publish Crania Americana. And so a phrenologist writes the whole introduction to his book. And a lot of his ideas that he articulates there are rooted in physiognomy and phrenology. So I teach it as kind of part of a larger context in which like these sciences simultaneously, I often teach about like how these sciences enforce power relationships. And I haven't found a good way yet to teach about like, okay, but then like how are people who are marginalized then like re-adopting and co-opting these sciences for their own purposes. But yeah, immigration and scientific racism is when I do it.
I think that's very helpful. Let's see. Okay, another one. I have a question around, this is from Heather. I have a question around the way that phrenology was embraced for possible liberatory goals. Do you have any thoughts on how biological determinism continues to be embraced like that? For instance, and how claims of born this way are used by LGBTQ plus movements, and what the risks of trying to use biological determinism for liberatory purposes?
Yeah, so I'm reading this question and also reading Rachel, or not Rachel, that's me. I'm reading Ashley's question on like how she knows I'm not a scientist, but like has this research changed your own thinking on modern science and how it informs gender? But you could also say race, and you could also say LGBTQ issues. I think I have come ultimately to this radical position that like we should not be depending on science to undergird our crusades for equality and justice. I think because we attach so much cultural prestige to science as somehow a superior way of knowing in the world, we have been kind of desperate to use the scientific method to be like, no, like your unequal racist or sexist opinions about the world are actually not scientific. Like I'm going to use science to disprove you. And I think as a historian of science, what I see is just like science repeatedly being used as a tool of oppression, and then people who are marginalized then adopting the same science and using that same science to then be like, no, you're just reading heads and faces wrong, right? And you kind of see this in like the LGBTQ, like born this way, that is a form of biological determinism. But I think it's not even just biological determinism. It's like when you are trying to scientifically prove human value, you've entered yourself into a weird crusade, because we should just take for granted that human beings are valuable and worthy of respect and dignity. And if you have to use the scientific method to prove that, then like you're already in a losing battle.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Okay. We have another one from Philip. Do you see it?
I think we skipped Alexi's question.
Oh.
Oh, hi, Alexi. So yeah, wait, how did Black men and Black women use phrenology differently? So Alexi, the answer is I just have a lot more evidence of Black men using phrenology, which I didn't talk about at all here. Black women, so basically like Charlotte Fortin uses phrenological and physiognomical language regularly, but she uses it primarily to talk about her white abolitionist allies. She never uses it to talk about the other Black people in her life. And I think that is probably, I think she was almost certainly aware of all of the like the minefield that she was wandering into when talking about phrenology. She had internalized a lot of white beauty standards too, and repeatedly referred to herself as like unattractive, whereas referring to her white female abolitionist allies as the most beautiful people she'd ever seen, for instance. So I think like, honestly, Black women realize that they are dealing with problematic discourses. Sojourner Truth gets her head examined, but she, unlike her other fellow like women's rights activists, she never gets her phrenological exam published. They do, right? So like, even though it's actually quite positive, she has a phrenological examiner who is also an abolitionist, but he's a white man, and she instead decides to circulate her own image in ways that she wants to do. So Black men engage in more detail with these sciences. Mia Bay writes a little bit about this. I don't want to take up too much time, but she writes like about how Black women are less willing and able to engage in racial theory of the time than Black men. And her big question is like, okay, so like, how are you supposed to, Black women are obviously thinking about race. They're obviously thinking about inequality, but like, how do you write a history of silence? So the answer is like, they're aware of physiognomy and phrenology. I know they are because they're using it, but they're not often using it to talk about equality in the same way that men are, if that makes sense.
Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, sure. I can stay.
Actually, maybe two more, because I have a closing one I want to ask you.
Okay.
From Philip. Given that many newer generations of immigrant people moving into the developing American cultural landscape were ever focused on blending into and advancing in early American society, do you think that the study of these sciences and the ideas around development that came with them operated in similar ways to ever-present ideas about consumer ideals around whiteness and how to achieve it as a gateway to economic and political success?
So I will just answer this question by citing this one 19th century article, which I think is so messed up and yet so illustrative of like how simultaneously problematic and weird and helpful like advocates of greater equality found these sciences. So William Goodall, the abolitionist, he basically says like we should give African Americans the right to vote, but he also then kind of says like, well, they don't deserve it yet. But they like will be able to once they improve, like basically once they blend into and advance. It's like this like politics of respectability argument where he says like, no, their brains aren't big enough yet. And no, their foreheads aren't high enough yet. But that doesn't mean they're not capable of improvement. So the way he uses the language of physiognomy and phrenology is like, we should grant these rights because it's the right thing to do. And then someday they will deserve them by improving their brain and in the process improving their beauty. So it's like this idea that like, it's almost like a meritocratic brain workout where you're like required to engage in this like cerebral exercise regimen.
Are there any recorded cases of someone improving their moral and intellectual capacity and then having an improved appearance as a result?
Well, I mean, I guess that would require that you trust the premise, right?
Right. I don't, but you can kind of, you force that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any like evidence of people like writing in their diaries like, oh yeah, I do have evidence actually of people being like, you know, I really am trying to work on these phrenological traits, right? So people are like trying to work on it. But certainly in publications, like in like fictional stories or in like phrenological magazines, like they provide examples. But like, do you trust those examples, right? Is the big question. But yeah, like they'll do these like side-by-side comparisons of like these two twins, for instance, that like one got into a life of drinking and like didn't work hard and, you know, wasn't moral and engaged, you know, ate too many spicy foods and drank alcohol and like, and they kind of show the development over time. But these are like handcrafted drawings. They're not like actual photographs of people. So real examples, probably not, but fake examples, yeah.
I think in our interactions, I mentioned that my class was reading Cesar Lombroso, and
yes,
there's a lot of invented examples in his work. So that's really what I meant.
That's a better way of describing it. Examples, yeah.
It's 6. Should we wrap it up? What do you think?
Oh man, now I wish I didn't speak as long. I feel bad. All these people didn't get their questions answered.
Can we sneak one?
Sure.
Well, this is my student, Satya. How did phrenology influence art that was not originally created to be used within science? What is the historical impact of phrenology on visual art?
Okay, yeah. So I would argue that there's not really in the 19th century a clear distinction between art and science. So a lot of artists think of themselves as scientific practitioners, and a lot of scientists think of themselves as artists as well. So for instance, there is this one artist, I don't know if you've heard of Hiram Powers, but Hiram Powers is probably the most famous sculptor in the 19th century. He does like busts of all of like famous politicians and like prominent people. And he also does like the Greek slave, for instance, and all of the, like, basically if you go to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, like Hiram Powers' sculptures are everywhere. He was an avid phrenologist. And so he was always having these conversations with his sitters about like what phrenological traits he was going to emphasize. Like if he was going to emphasize, like he told one woman she was used to wearing her hair kind of further down on her forehead. And he was like, in the sculpture, I'm going to bring it back a little bit and make you look like an intellectual. He's like, don't worry. Like you'll still look, you know, you'll still have like your character or whatever, but like, I'm going to move your hair a little around so that I can emphasize certain phrenological traits. So he is just, for him, phrenology is as much an artistic practice as it is a scientific practice.
Thank you so much. I think that's our time. I'm sad. I want to keep going, but thank you so much for sharing your incredible research with us, and to everyone else who made this possible, and also for the attendees. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Would you mind, is there a way to save these questions or no? Maybe I'll just copy and paste them if I can.
Yeah, I can get those questions to you by tomorrow.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is lovely.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.